Okay. Greetings. My name is Ida Schmidt-Chait, and my maiden name was Ida Rosenberg. And so I'm here with these two young ladies from Goucher College, and I'm going to do a videotape. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So can I start reading?
Yeah,
Yes, please.
Yes. This is very important, and I need to read it because, by reading I can express myself better.
Okay.
So I just want to note that every experience is unique for people.
Mm-hmm.
Some people were sent to concentration camps. Some people stayed in ghettos. Some people were in the forest and they hid in the forest.
Mm.
And some were partisans, which were like soldiers in hiding. And some were deported to slave labor camps. And so we tell our stories to as many people as we can so they will never forget. And it is very important to continue this as a legacy. And each testimony is a legacy for generations to follow and honor the more than 6 million whose stories will never be heard. The future generations should be reminded of the atrocities, genocide, intolerance, indifference, injustice that took place during the war. And so, for the people to never forget, and so that another Holocaust will never happen again. Consequences of the Holocaust, what is to embrace love in the face of horror, suffering, and inhumanity, and it taught me to become strong and a desire and a zest for life, and never to take life for granted. Life is very precious, and the importance of appreciation of family, friends, and future generations that will perpetuate peace on earth and life and love. And so I must say that I count my blessings day by day, that I am alive and I lived through this horrific Holocaust. So now I can tell you my story of my childhood.
Yeah, we have some questions that we can ask you. And
Yes.
Awesome. Where were you born and when? Your hometown and your birthday?
Okay. I was born in Warsaw, Poland, October 30th, 1931.
And you said your birth name was Ida Rosenberg, correct?
Yes, my name was Ida Rosenberg.
How do you spell that? Just so we don't.
Rosenberg,
Perfect.
which means the mountain of roses. That's a German name.
Yeah.
Rosenberg is a mountain.
Never knew that. Can you tell us a bit about what life was like before the war?
Okay.
Also, who was your mother and father? Sorry.
Yes.
And siblings?
My parents' names, you want their name?
Yes.
My mother's name was Miriam. In Poland, they called her Mania,
How do you spell that?
M-A-N-I-A, Mania,
Manya.
Mania. She was sometimes called Mary also.
Mhm.
Depends what country we were in.
What was her last name?
And her last name was W-O-S-K, Vosk.
Vosk.
And my father was, his name was Israel, sometimes called Izzy in the United States, Rosenberg.
Do you remember their birthdays by chance?
Yes, I do. My dad was born in 1905 and my mother in 1910. So I just want to let you know that my father, he worked in Boston.
He did?
Yes, he was a tailor. So he worked for Lord & Taylor in Boston. And when people would come and get introduced to him, he would say, "My name is Easy. Easy come and easy go." That was his thing. He was a master tailor, really.
That's awesome. Do you have any? Did you have any siblings, brothers or sisters?
Yes, I have one sister, and her name is Celia, C-E-L-I-A. And you want her last name?
Good.
Sure.
Is Zifroni. Z-I-F-R-O-N-Y. That's like Zipporah. Yes. That's a Hebrew name.
Oh, okay.
Zifroni,
Sippy
yes.
in English.
Got you. And just one sister?
Yes, one sister, she was born in 1938.
And at the start of
That's
the war.
pretty important to know.
Yes,
Yes.
indeed. So now, can you tell us
Okay.
about what life was like before the war?
What did you want to ask me?
Can you tell us what life was like before the war?
Sure. So before the war, my parents actually met in my mother's town where she lived with her parents. She was the oldest of 8 children. And they met in a town, a city called Schmidt-Chait. Yeah. I have to write it down for you to see. Or Schmidt-Chait. Schmidt-Chait. In Polish, it's pronounced Schmidt-Chait.
Let me hold that up for them. That's what it is.
Yes, my father came from Warsaw.
But that's where they met in...
He came from Warsaw to Siedlce when he was a young man, and he was delivering a package to a lady, a relative that lived in a house, in a building. And my mother happened to be visiting her grandmother in that building. So when they saw each other, they greeted each other, and he said, "I'm from Warsaw, and I live in Warsaw, and I would love to see your city." So my mother said, "Sure, I will take you, around and show you." And of course, after a little while, she invited him to their home, to my mother's parents' home. And years ago, when people used to travel, usually they would stop somewhere, they would be invited to have dinner. So he was invited to stay in the home, and then he asked permission if he could come and visit my mother again. And so this is how they dated. He used to come from Warsaw because he worked in Warsaw, and they dated, and then they got married.
How far away is Schmidt-Chait?
Approximately Warsaw from Siedlce would be about 100 kilometers.
Okay. Too bad.
And so do you have any vivid memories from your childhood?
Yes, I have wonderful memories. First of all, I was the firstborn grandchild in the family on my mother's side. And so my mother had brothers and sisters, they doted over me, but I was never spoiled. I was a good girl. And with my own parents, I lived in Warsaw, and as a young child, my parents, I have pictures, they took me to circus, they took me to the parks, and my mother would take me to the movies, because when I was young, the first movie I saw was with Shirley Temple in Warsaw. Yes. And then, you know what, the movies with Abbott and Costello?
Yes.
Like these comedians.
Yeah.
It was called Flip and Flop. So they had comedians, and I would see certain movies and children's movies. And I had a wonderful life there. My father worked, and he used to take pictures also. He was a photographer, and he was a master tailor. But my mother did not work. He took care of me. And then they would take me for rides, and we would go because Warsaw was also it was near a river. So they had boats, and like here, they would take me on a boat ride, and we would spend time together. And I had friends. In Europe, the houses were situated in such a way that in the middle of the houses, there was like a open area.
Like a courtyard.
A courtyard, right, where they had flowers or maybe a little fountain, and the children used to socialize in that area. So we used to play, and we also used to use chalk and draw with chalk on the floor and make different flowers or whoever wanted, and then also jump where you jump here too, you know, in the squares.
Hopscotch?
Hopscotch. 1, 2, 3, hopscotch,
Yep.
right?
We
did that as a child, right? And then we also jumped rope. And then when I was 7, I started first grade.
So that was.
And the only language that I spoke then was Polish. I did not know any other language. My parents spoke Polish, and they also spoke Yiddish, which is Jewish. But I did not know any of that. So I started first grade.
Did you have any close friends at that point? Do you remember any of your close friends?
Yes, I remember that where we lived in the building, there was a boy that was my age. And so we became very good friends. You know, like children play together, yes. And then there was a little girl that was about maybe a year older than I, and we were friends also. So there were a lot of children in the court, because the buildings, it was not like one building, there were several buildings. So I had quite a few friends, but I do not remember their names. It was a long time ago.
It's okay.
But I had a wonderful childhood, really. And then in 1938, my sister was born. So.
What was school like for you? You said you started in first grade?
Yes, I started first grade, and it was like in Poland, like any school, you know, the children were taught, and we were taught the alphabet, and we were taught how to start writing letters, and because in Polish the alphabet is not the same as, you know, you don't pronounce it like here.
No.
You know, it's like here is ABC, in Polish it's ABC. So we had to learn the alphabet, And of course, they had a big board, and they would write the numbers, like 1, 2, 3, and we would learn how to count. And just like in any school, and then we would sing songs. So I know a few Polish songs that are like for children. And I could sing one real quick.
Of course,
Go
please.
ahead.
Okay.
Please.
Like in every country, you have like a specific child, a person that is dressed in the outfits that they wear in that specific. Like here, you have cowboys,
Yes.
right? And the children have cowboy boots, cowboy hats. Well, there they had Krakowiaczek. That was a child that was Krakowiaczek. So the song goes, excuse me, Krakowiaczek jeden, jeden is one.
One. Yep.
Miał koników 7, he had 7 horses. Koń is a horse. Pojechał na wojnę, he went to the war. Został mu się 1. 7 lat wojował, he was in the war for 7 years. Wojny nie, szabli nie wyjmował. He had a saber, szabla. He didn't take it out. Szabla zadzerwiała I wojny nie widziała. So the saber became rotten, and it rotted, and it never saw the war. So in other words, he really did not fight, but it was just a song.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I interpreted it into English. Yeah, so school was very good, and then my sister was born in 1938, and I was very happy that I got a sibling, and that life went on very, very lovely. So then my grandparents decided to give my mother a little rest, and they sent 2 of their sons, my mother's 2 brothers. One was called David, and one was Leon. They came by train, they picked me up, and I came to my grandparents' home because it was already the first year after school, and it was summertime. And they were going to a resort up in the mountains. It was called Schmidt-Chait. I don't know if I could write it down, but if you want me to,
Yeah.
would you like that?
If it's an important place, yeah.
Yes. It's an H. Ho. It's a long word. Chinek. Schmidt-Chait. That's a resort in the mountains.
In northern Poland, or?
And where my grandparents lived, yes, it was part of the northern part of Poland. And they took their 2 youngest siblings with them, and they took me along. So they took my uncle, his name was Abraham, and my aunt, he was around 13, or maybe a little younger, and my aunt, she was the youngest of the 8 children. Her name was Fela, in Polish, F-E-L-A, or in Yiddish, they used to call her Fegele. Fegele is a bird, Tzipora, Fegele. So it's Fegele, just the way you hear it. F-E-I-G-E-L-E, Fegele. So the 3 of us and my grandparents, I didn't give you their names.
Oh,
yes,
thank
my
you.
grandparents, my grandfather's name was Moses, or Moshe.
How do you spell it in Polish? Moshe.
Moshe.
How do you spell that?
Moshe. M-O-I-S-H-E. Moshe. And my grandmother was Rachel. Ruchel in Hebrew. and their last name is W-O-S-K, Vosk. Me with their two siblings to Schmidt-Chait, and we stayed there most of the summer, and then we were going back because I had to go back to Warsaw to my parents because I going to start second grade. And so my mother had there were 8, 4 sisters and 3 brothers.
Mm-hmm.
So the youngest was, like I told you, his name was Abraham. And do you want to know the names of all the sisters and the brothers? If that is important
If you'd like.
as a history?
Yeah.
Okay, so my mother was the oldest, and her name was Mary. Then she had a brother. His name was Leo, and a sister. Her name was Chaya,
Hi, yeah.
C-H-A-Y-A,
A-Y-A.
Life.
Chaya.
That means life, yeah.
Okay, her middle name was Leah. And then another brother, David. And then a sister, Hannah, H-C-H-A-N-A, and another sister, Batya, B-A-T-I-A. And then it was Abraham and Fela, the ones that I gave you. So they were all my aunts and uncles, and they were just a wonderful, beautiful family, really.
So you guys were coming back from...
So we came back to Shedlitz from Schmidt-Chait, and my uncles were going to take me back to Warsaw, and it was September. And I never went back to Warsaw because the Germans attacked Poland and occupied Poland within 6 weeks in September of 1939.
Did you ever see soldiers as a child? Like during those 6 weeks, did they come into your town? Or
I'm sorry?
did the soldiers ever come into your town? Did you ever see them, or you just weren't able to get into Warsaw because of them?
Which, my family?
You personally.
Oh, my mother's siblings?
Or you?
No.
Did you see them?
Well, now I want to tell you what happened.
Okay.
So I could never go back to Warsaw. In the meantime, my father was drafted into the Polish army. And my father was blonde and tall, and he had a little mustache. And he was in the Polish army in the medics, like helping with people that would get injured. Okay. And my mother remained alone with my sister. By that time, she was almost 2 years old in Warsaw, all alone. And I was with my grandparents. So I will tell you about what was going on during the 6 weeks of war. Every city was bombarded so bad that it was just unbearable. And we lived close to a station, a railroad station. And my grandfather used to import leather and build beautiful boots, like for the people that lived in the countryside, farmers. And he also created ladies' shoes, more like sandals, and beautiful shoes for children and for women. And so he knew the farmers, they're out in the farmland, and he went to ask them if we could stay with them. So they took us, the whole family, and they kept us down in a bunker during the bombardment. And then my Aunt Basha, my mother's sister, got an appendix attack. So he had appendicitis.
Yes.
So we all went to take her to the hospital. And every hospital then had a Red Cross on the roof to make sure that the hospitals were not bombarded. And so my aunt was operated. She was 16 years old then. And because the bombs were falling all over the place, we had to get her out of the hospital. And so my grandparents went indoors to get her. And it was a huge park, part of the hospital, with many trees and beautiful flowers, like a park around the hospital. And they bombarded into the park. So my aunt, my mother's sister, Fela, and I, we were sort of thrown into the bomb fell in such a way that it did not explode, but it made a huge hole. And we fell into the hole, and we were up to our necks with the sand and everything. So my uncles and my grandfather and the people that were around, they were hiding in that place because they thought that they will not be injured there or hurt because of a hospital area. And so they tried to, and they dug us out of that huge hole that we were buried in. And from there, we went back to the person that was hiding us in the bunk. Well, it was like in a cellar, and we stayed there until the Germans came in and occupied Schedlce. So after that, we all went back to the house, to my grandparents' house, and apparently the word came out that the SS was going around, and they were looking for young men. So my grandfather had a room without a window where he used to hang the leather, and they would keep the leather in the room. And he had a huge wardrobe. You know, in Europe we didn't have closets. We had wardrobes. So he took, during the day, the sons that were in their early 20s, my uncles, Leo and David, and even the younger one. He took all the sons and put them in that room, and we pushed the wardrobe against the door and covered the door. So when the SS came looking for young men, my grandfather said, "Oh, you soldiers were here already. They already took my sons away. I had 2 sons and they took them away." And the girls were all teenagers, you know, they were all teens. So at that point, they did not touch the girls yet. However, I was very blonde, and I had long blonde hair, and the only language I spoke was Polish. So near where we lived, they used to have an outdoor bazaar, and people would come out with with fruit or vegetables or something, and we had no food at that time. There was nothing to be had. So the farmers would come out and they would be selling the food. So I would be the one that would go out and get some food for the household, because I looked very Gentile. You know, I was slender, I was tall, and the rest of the family, my father was blonde and I was blonde, but my mother's family, they all had dark hair. So I went to the market and I used to buy some food, and across the way, the German Gestapo and SS, they settled into a huge building that was like, it looked like a church, and it could have been a church, but they went in and they settled there. So at that time, the Russians and the Germans, they made a pact that they are not going to attack one another. And so one night, in the middle of the night, a big train came through Schedlce, and it stopped on the station, the railroad station. And my grandfather lived through World War One because the Germans also took over Poland during World War One. So he knew what would happen. He was a very bright man. He was a businessman at his young age already. So he went out at night to the train and he talked to the commander of the train because it was a military train with soldiers. And he asked the commander if he would be able to take his family on the train and go wherever they are going and get us out from Schedlitz. And he would give them boots, he would give them money, anything they wanted. They could come into the house and take anything they liked just to take us and put us on the train. So I got dressed, had a little coat and a hat, a little sailor hat, and my siblings and my grandparents' children, in the middle of the night. I had a little bag in my hand, and everybody carried a little bag, left everything. And we walked around the edge of the buildings and right next to the walls of the buildings so they wouldn't be able to see us. But we were very fortunate because we lived very close to the railroad station. And we got onto the train. And the next day the train took off and it stopped in Minsk.
Oh, Minsk, that's where my friend lives.
Yes. Minsk was occupied by the Russians at that time. And so they took us, the commander of the train took us to a house where we could stay. And the house was very big. I remember it was beautiful. Inside the house, there must have been a Polish general or somebody that lived there because they had a separate room for children with toys in there. And I remember that we could play in that room. And we would go out in Minsk, and my grandfather, the family, we would try and barter and get some food so we would have some food while we were living in that house. At that time, after this, when the Germans occupied Poland, my father, he survived the war and he came back to Warsaw. And my mother was all alone with my sister. During that time, my sister was a baby and my mother had no food, and so she could not nurse her. My mother had, instead of milk, blood was coming out from her breast. So she would go from neighbor to neighbor and barter with them. And she would have maybe a piece of soap or a little sugar in her apartment. And she would barter with neighbors to give her a little bit of farina, which is a little cereal for children. And so she would have something to feed my sister. And my sister was not doing very well. She was a baby, and she did not have the right nutrition. So my dad comes home.
When did your dad get back to Warsaw?
My father came back to Warsaw after the war.
Oh, after everything?
Yes.
Okay.
And when the Germans occupied Warsaw, and Warsaw was bombarded so badly that you could only see chimneys. Go ahead.
Wait, was this after World War II ended?
No.
After the 6 weeks.
After the Germans occupied Poland.
Oh, okay, sorry.
They
The war.
occupied Poland. That was the first country that they attacked
Yes.
and occupied in 6
Yes,
weeks.
sorry.
Okay.
My mistake.
So no, that's
So
okay.
after these 6 weeks, your parents joined you guys in with your grandparents?
Yes, but
Okay.
you don't know how. So my father says, "Where is Ida?" And my mother says, "Well, they took off. I don't know." So my father went to Schedlitz, and the neighbors told him that what happened with the Russian soldiers that came on the train, and that the grandparents went to the next city, which was Minsk, and they must be in Minsk. I don't know how my dad came, but he came to Minsk, and to my grandparents. He found them, and he says, I'm going to take Ida back to Warsaw, to home. And my grandfather said, no, you go back home, take your wife and the baby, and I will give you money, and you pay the river people to take you on a boat and smuggle you during the night across the river and put you on a train to go to get to Minsk, so you would be with us. And that's what happened. My mother took my sister, bundled her up, and they took along cubed sugar. I don't know if you ever see that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so they gave it, and it wasn't just my parents and my sister. There were many, many people that did that. They gave the people that owned the little boats, they paid them to take them across the Wisla River, and they would hide during the night. They did that, and the little children, they would give the cubed sugar into their mouth so they wouldn't cry. And it was very quiet in the middle of the night, and my dad, my sister, and my mother went across, took a train, and came to my parents, to Minsk, to my grandparents rather. And we were there for about 2 or 3 months, and it was on the Russian side. So one night we were sleeping in that house, and we heard banging on the shutters of the windows. And the Russian soldiers came with bayonets, and they opened up the doors and they said, you have to get up and get dressed. Just take whatever you can carry in your hand, like some clothing. We have to move you from here because Minsk is going to become a border town with the Germans.
Did they know you were Jewish? Or was it just because all the residents had to move?
Well, they didn't know at the time that we were Jewish,
Yeah.
because, it was war.
Mm-hmm.
So they said, we will take you to the railroad station and we will send you to a town not too far away from here, and you will get settled like maybe a few 100 kilometers from here.
Mm-hmm.
And we were not the only ones. There were hundreds and hundreds of Jewish people like that. They put us on a cattle train.
So it was for Jews specifically.
Yes.
They were doing this.
Yes, they put us on a cattle train, and they shipped us for 30 days and 30 nights to the Gulag, to Siberia, to a forced labor camp. So first we arrived in Archangel, which in Russian it's called Arkhangelsk. In English it's called Archangel.
Do you know how to spell that?
It's like Archangel.
Okay.
And you will look it up on the map, you will see that it's all the western part of Russia, all the way out. They put us on a barge.
Mm-hmm.
A huge barge, and they shipped us on a river all the way to no man's land. There were 500 kilometers of forests, and there were barracks. And there weren't enough barracks for all the people that they shipped there. And I will tell you the name of the city because I have it written down for you. It wasn't a city. It was a no man's land. They had barracks, and they put us into the barracks. And the name of the place was called, here, I know these glasses. The name of the place was called Chorny Yar, and it's CHERNY. Another word is YAR. And then it was Ust, UST, VIM, Ustvim.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in Komi Komi. It was USSR. It's pronounced ISSR. It was in Siberia,
Siberia.
near the tundra.
Yep.
So we wound up there next to a river. And what they gathered everybody, and they gave us clothing to wear there in Siberia, because the winter was coming already. So they gave us, the women were wearing like babushkas, you know, the triangular little things. And we got jackets that were padded with cotton inside. They were called fufaika. I don't know if I could spell it for you. F-U, fu, F-A-I-K-A. Right, fufaika, just like you hear. And then they gave us pants that were padded also with cotton. And they gave us boots. They were called valenki. V-A-L-E-N-K-Y. Valenki. Those were boots. They were made out of wool, and they gave us pieces of rags. So before you put on the boots, you have to wrap your feet with rags to have many layers, because the temperature there would go down below 30 and 40. And we lived among a huge area of forest. So what the men used to do, they used to cut down the trees of the forest, in the forest. And the women, they would put, I don't know what you would call that. I think they call it like a horse. You know, there are like two pieces of wood here, one in the middle and two here to hold up this piece of wood.
Mm-hmm.
And so in between they would put the tree, the cut down tree, and the women would stand and they would sew with hand saws pieces of the tree that were round, round pieces, and then they would chop them into little squares, little pieces, and put them into big sacks. And then these sacks would be shipped on the river to the next town, and they used that wood for the little boats, that help big boats.
Yeah,
Tugboats.
tugboats.
What is it?
Tugboat.
Tugboats, right. They used them for tugboats, to get them going, I guess, for their machinery. And so the men, and they also took the wood that they cut down, the trees, they would roll them down the edge of the river, down to the river, and there was a huge station that's sitting in the middle of the river. And on that station was a huge machinery that they operated, the men, 12 to 14 hours a day and at night. And this machinery would take the logs and they would bind them together, maybe like a dozen logs, bind them and ship them down the river to the next town or wherever they needed the logs from the forest. And so...
What did you do during this time? Were you cutting wood or?
No, we had one room, and in the room were my grandparents and 1, 2, 3, 4, and only 4 of the siblings, I will tell you, they did not survive the war, and I will tell you how. What happened was, when we were in Minsk, my grandfather sent his daughter Chaya and the two brothers, David and Leo, to go back to Shedlitz and marry her to her fiancé. She was engaged, to marry her off and come back to Minsk with her. By the time they went back to Shedlitz, by the time they arranged a quick marriage and were coming back, the river froze and they couldn't come back anymore. And we got, later after the war, we found out that they did the most horrendous thing to my aunt, my mother's sister. She was pregnant at the time, and what they did to her, the Germans, is unreal, unbelievable. And then they found the brothers, they were in the partisans in the woods, in the forests, and they found them, and somebody squealed on them, which happened many, many times, and so they perished. So they weren't with us anymore. So the rest of the siblings and my parents, my sister and I, we stayed in a room that was about a third of this room. And we slept on the floor. And there in the room was a big oven that was called piechka. And I'll spell it for you.
I'm learning a lot of Russian today.
Piechka. Piechka. It's an oven. And we kept the oven going, and I used to chop the wood. By then I was 8 years old already. I would chop the wood, and my uncle, my mother's youngest brother, and keep the oven going, because this is the only way we could keep warm in the room. So the children, my aunt, my youngest mother's sister, and my uncle, and I, and my little sister, she was the baby, we slept next to the oven because for warmth. And then for food, they had a huge room in the barracks where they used to collect everybody, and we would get once a day, we would get a soup. It was called ucha. U-C-H-A. Ucha. Not yucha, but ucha. Ucha. It was supposed to be with potatoes and fish, but you had to fish for the fish. There was no fish, and there might have been one little slice of potato. That was our meal for the day. So they gathered all the children from the campsite, and we went to a school. It was mandatory. The school was 4 kilometers away. It was a hut, a small little hut. The children that lived there, they were the natives. They were called Komis, because it's in what was in Komi. So they went to school like from morning, 9 o'clock in the morning till maybe 12, and we went to school in the afternoon from like 12:30 maybe till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And in school, they gave us one slice of bread that was this big. So you could figure it out, about 2.5, 3 inches by 3 inches. And I took the bread and I hid it because my sister was not well. And I used to come to the house, to the place where we lived after school, and I used to feed her like a little bird, my piece of bread, so she would have something to eat. Before I would go with all the children to the school, I used to take her and drop her off into a room where they would gather, all the little children, like 2, 3, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and they would stay there when the parents would be at work. My father worked between 10 and 12 hours a day, and my mother worked about 10 hours, standing and sewing the woods. And we used to come in after school, and in the winter, we had to go to school in 32 below zero. We walked 4 kilometers to school. You know how your nose starts to drip?
Yep.
I had icicles hanging from my nose. I have on each side of my feet 2 toes that were totally frozen. They don't have any feeling in them altogether. This is how terrible it was there. And besides not having food, they used to gather the people once a month, and the head of the camp, he was called a nachalnik. He would gather all the people and brainwash them and say to them, "You're going to die here in Siberia. So if you become Russian citizens, you will be treated better." But my parents never took up Russian citizenship, never. And a lot of people didn't. There were many, many people there in our camp that came from different parts of Poland. And they came from quite wealthy families. And they could not tolerate the kind of treatments that we were getting. And so many of them committed suicide. Many of them would go in the springtime, and they would go under the logs that were sitting in the river. They would go right under them and drown to commit suicide. It was a horrific way of life. Not only did we have very little food, we had many, many, many diseases. So in the springtime, the top layer of the ground would melt, and it would become mud. And in the mud germinated mosquitoes that were about 1.5 inches big, huge black mosquitoes. And these mosquitoes gave us malaria. So I had malaria, my parents had malaria in Siberia. I don't remember whether my sister did, but my sister had dysentery, which is diarrhea with blood. This is how bad the situation was. And I had it too. Then I got, what they did is we had a very poor hygiene. We didn't have any toothbrushes, toothpaste like you guys have. So we got lice in our heads, and the lice would jump from one to another, and they would create diseases. So I had typhoid fever there, and people died from it, from typhoid fever. But when I was a little girl, my mother gave me a very good, good nutrition. So apparently I was strong enough and I could live through it. And it was just the most terrible situation there, the most terrible lifestyle. So there was very little food. And once, if I tell you one time, they gave all the children an apple. So I took the apple, and the top has that
the stem. Yeah.
The stem, I hung it on a string, and every day I took a bite of the apple, and I let my sister have part of the apple too. That's how bad the situation was. We did not have paper to write on, so they gave us newspapers, and we would write in between the printed part. So this would be the printed part. In between, we would do our homework. We had no electricity. We had kerosene lamps, with a wick, and we would do our homework at night with a kerosene lamp and a wick. We also had polar nights, and where during the nighttime, it would be total daytime. And when we would walk to school in the winter, the summer lasted only about 6 weeks. That's all. That's the period of the summer. And so during that time, some people would try and grow something in the earth, and they would try and grow potatoes. So we also got a potato per person on occasion. And so my father and this was against the law. He would get up in the middle of the night, and I do not know how. He went to the river, he opened up a hole, and I don't know, but he would catch a fish or two, and we would bury the fish into the ground so it would stay, frozen and fresh. And then when we would get the potato, I know my mother would take a little pot and cook the fish and the potato. So my grandparents and we would have a little food to eat. That was our food. If we had it. There were days that we had no food whatsoever, and the conditions were horrible. So not only did people commit suicide.
So were you learning Russian in school?
I was in school there.
Yeah, were you learning Russian or were you still speaking Polish?
Oh yes, so in school we had to learn Russian and we had to learn Komi, the language of the natives. The natives were a mixture of Eskimos and Mongolians. It was a mixture, and they spoke their own language. It was called Komi. So we had to learn Russian and Komi. We had many, many epidemics. We were also dehumanized. It was like we lived like, it was terrible. So I had long blonde hair, not only I, but the other children, because of the lice, they went and they cut all our hair off. Mm-hmm. It was just awful, terrible.
Do you know how old you were at this time?
8 years old. We were deprived. There was deprivation. We had no medical care. We had minimal hygienic care. And I will tell you what they used to do. They used to collect all the girls and the women in the camp and bring us into a big room. And they had these huge kettles with warm water. And we would get inside. It was like a huge kettle. And this is how we would bathe. Once or twice a month. We were lucky if it would be twice a month. Then when the women would come out, the men would come in and they would get in and wash themselves. We had no soap, we had nothing. So they would give us the things to dry ourselves right then and there, and they would take it away. And this is how we washed ourselves.
Do you know how many people were in this camp? In this labor camp?
Oh, there must have been more than 200-300, more.
Did you get to know a lot of the people there?
Well, I couldn't get to know too many people because most of the people worked till 12 hours a day or 10 hours a day. The only ones that I would know was my own immediate family and the people that were next to us, maybe, and the children that I went to school with. Yeah. And that was it. And the conditions were just unbearable. And not only did we have dysentery, which is, diarrhea with blood, my father got very sick and they took him to a hospital and we thought that we'll never see him again because there was very, very little medication and very little medicine for people like that. But somehow he got out of there, and he was the one that would, once in a while, in the middle of the night, like 3 a.m. in the morning, go out and catch a fish. I still don't know how he did it, but he would catch a fish, and this would be part of our protein at times. At this time, the Germans and the Russians, the Germans were already attacking Russia. And so by then it was the siege of Leningrad. I don't know if you're familiar with that?
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Okay. And it was getting worse and worse. So there was a Polish government in exile in London.
Yes.
And they made a pact with the Russian government to let all the Polish um, we were like totally displaced,
Mhm.
you know, and we were in forced labor camps. All the people were. So where were we going to go, right? So they put us back on cattle trains, and they shipped us to the steppes of Central Asia.
Do you know what year that was? Or that was the
It
year of
was-
Leningrad?
No, that was in 1943.
You left the labor camp.
We didn't leave. They put us on a cattle train. First, they put us on a boat. We went back to Arkansas because there were no trains where we were. And there, they put us on a train, like you saw. Did you go to the Holocaust Memorial Museum and you saw the boxcar?
Yeah.
We were in that car. And they put us in like cattle. And we traveled for 30 days and 30 nights. They used to open up the doors like every 2 days and let us out to go to a canal and wash ourselves. They would have somebody standing with a big container with soup and gave us little containers with soup to eat. And I don't know, did you see what the boxcar looks like?
Yeah.
So here is the car, right? And inside, on each side, they would have 2 planks of wood, and the children would sleep on top of the planks, and the people, the grown-ups, would sleep on the floor. And they had 2 little windows on each side of the boxcar, if you remember. So while we were human beings and we had to go to the bathroom. So the people would go up on the plank here, and somebody would be standing with a cloth or something and cover them up, and they would remove their cloth and go out into the little window with their backside and eliminate like that and go to the bathroom. Because we were locked into the cattle, into the boxcar. For 2-3 days in a row, we traveled like that all the way, and we wound up in Uzbekistan.
Can you hold on 1 second? I'm not sure what's happening with the video.
In the boxcar, there must have been at least 25 to 30 people. We were like cramped, one against the other.
Mm-hmm.
And people were just sitting, we had no place where to sleep. Like I said, the children were up on the plank up there, cuddling one next to another, and using the little windows to evacuate, to go to the bathroom, like animals. And then, after 30 days, they dropped us off in a place called Samarkand.
Do you know how to spell that?
Yes, I will tell you how to do this. Samarkand.
S-A-M-A-R.
T.
Candy.
Okay, here you are. Samarkand, Uzbekistan. That's the part of the Russian. It's like here you have states.
Mm-hmm.
That was part of their state, Uzbekistan. It's near Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Turkestan, in the southern part of Russia. And of course, they let us off the train. And again, we had no place to live. So we lived in the street. They supplied us with like maybe a little place, a blanket or something. And there were hundreds of people that lived in the street. And then we had an epidemic. All the little children got chickenpox and measles.
Including you?
No, I was already, I did not get it then, at that time. But what my mother did, she hid my sister under that little blanket. When they came, the Russian people from the hospitals came to pick up all the children that had the measles or chickenpox. And they said, we'll take them to the hospital and we'll bring them back. They took them away and we never saw them again. So my mother sat on my sister. She like leaned against her because they took only the little ones, you know, and they didn't take my sister away. And this is how my sister was saved. So we stayed in the street for about 3 weeks because in Uzbekistan, at the time, you know that it's a very hot country, but when we got there, it was snowing already there. We brought the snow from Siberia. It was horrible. And my dad found a place for us to go and live. So we stayed in a little hut that was owned by a little old lady. She had 2 little houses like that, one for herself, and the little hut was supposed to be for her son and daughter-in-law. Well, her son was in the army and the daughter-in-law left, so she gave us the hut. The hut was made out of hay and mud, and they used to dry it and then on the walls, and then we put it together. And there were no windows, it was just a door. And you would walk in, and in the middle of the hut was a little hole in the middle, and we would they would give us some coal, and you would put the coal in that hole, and this is where you would get heat during the winter times. And we still got malaria there too, because the malaria did not go away. In Siberia, they gave us pills. They were called quinine in English and chinina in Russian.
What were they?
They were against malaria.
Oh,
They were
okay.
little round pills, sort of yellowish, bitter, like you've never tasted anything like this in your life. But we had to take it. It was against malaria. And now here, I'm not allowed to give blood, or anybody that had malaria, or typhoid fever, we're not allowed to give blood. So in Uzbekistan, they took my father and many other people that came there, and they put them in a factory. And my father was a tailor. So he worked in a factory where they brought in material from the things that you fly down from an airplane that opens up.
Parachute.
A parachute. Thank you. Yes, it was just horrible. Used parachutes they brought into the factory, and they made children's dresses for children, orphaned children. And so my father was working in the factory there, and my mother worked also. They were packaging, you know, the stuff. And so my sister and I got a little dress like that. And my sister went to a kindergarten. I would go with her in a school, because by then she was already 5 years old or so. And I would be in school. And by then my hair was already long, as I had 2 blonde braids, and the children used to call us Zhide. Zhide means Jews,
Yeah,
Jews in Russian. And they would yell Zhide do Palestine, which means Zhide, Jews go to Palestine, just like that. And one day, I will never, of course you never forget these things, they bunched up on me and they started beating me up. So I ran into the school to my teacher. And of course, they didn't punish them or anything like that, you know, but the teacher said that not to do it ever again. But the next time, a girl came with a big scissor like this, and she says, "You don't need your hair, your braids. I'm going to take care of your braids." She was going to cut my hair, cut my braids off. That's how horrible the situation was. They used to still throw stones after the Jewish kids in school. We had a horrible, horrible life there. And we had no shoes because it was very hot. And in Siberia, we were wearing those boots. And in Uzbekistan, we were walking around barefoot. totally barefoot. So we learned Uzbek, the language of the Uzbek people there, and Russian.
How old were you at this point?
Well,
Roughly
41, 10, 41, I was about
12,
12, 13, yes. And by then, a miracle happened, and the war ended in May of 1945. My father, when we were in Uzbekistan, he always tried to get us, he always bartered and tried to get us food. It was very little food to be had. And due to that fact, we had very bad teeth, including me and my mother and my father. We had very bad sight. Our bodies were not healthy, and we were not well people. So this is all during the war, and we were actually ostracized and beaten and done anything that you can imagine to us Jewish people. So after the war, we never became Russian citizens. So what are you going to do? They put us on a cattle train all over again.
Yeah. I have a question though. So was there a Jewish community in the Samarkand in that town where you had that
No.
hut and everything? No,
No.
it was just you guys.
My grandparents we lived in the new town, which is next to a railroad station. My parents, my sister, my mom, and I. My grandparents and their siblings lived in the old town. And there, my grandfather and my uncle, my mother's brother, by then he was already a teenager.
Was this Leon?
Well, he must have been, if I was 13, he must have been about 17 already or so. My grandfather and my uncle, they started producing little slippers. They were called tapochki. And it was made out of sheep's skin. Tapochki. CH is a ch. Tapochki. Because my grandfather couldn't work in a factory. So he and his son would buy this, they would barter, and they would buy the sheepskin, and they would produce tapochki in Samarkand and sold them on the market because they had, the Uzbek people also went through the war. It was everywhere. But they had bazaars. And so they would come out with their whatever they had, and they bartered. There was no money. You couldn't buy anything if you had money. And so they bartered, and my grandfather would barter for the shoes and get maybe flour, or maybe a potatoes or something. And when we were in Uzbekistan, one of my teeth became infected. And they didn't have dentists or anybody, so I got a terrible infection here. I have a scar here on my cheek. I got such an infection that my temperature was over 104. I was delirious, and there was no hospital. My mother took off her wedding band, and my father gave them the watch. We went to a clinic, and he gave them the watch and my mother's wedding band. So they would take me in, and I will never forget, they put me on a bed in the clinic, and they put a bucket on the floor because I had pus that was running out of my cheek. I would have died. They might have given me something because they were not antibiotics. There was nothing there. And they operated on it, and I don't know how they sewed it up, but I have a scar here on the side. And of course, we had all the different diseases that were unbearable. somehow we must have been strong and we survived. And then after that, they put us on another cattle train again and shipped us to Poland.
And that was in 44?
That was in 45.
45, sorry, 45.
In 45. So while the train was going, and we were going through the forest in one area in Poland, and I can't tell you exactly where, but it was in Poland. The train had all the Jewish people from different camps from Siberia. They stopped the train. In Poland, formed an army, an underground army, and they were called themselves Armia Krajowa, the army of the country. But they were an underground people that helped the Germans during World War II. So they stopped the train and started shooting at us. They said, "Oh, give us your money, give us your diamonds," but we had absolutely nothing. We had no clothing, just the clothing that was on our back. And so they ran over and they disconnected 3 boxcars, and they were going to kill. And in one of the boxcars was my family and my grandparents, but my mother's sister, and she got married in Siberia. One of my mother's sisters got married in Siberia. And my uncle, he ran over and connected the train again. And I didn't tell you, in Siberia, when we were walking to school, my uncle, in the middle of the road, the 4 kilometers that we were going, he was repairing hoofs for the horses. And he was in a hut, and he had the fire going, and he had, I don't remember the English word for it, where you use a special instrument to keep the fire going in order to fix the hoofs. So we would stop in the middle of this road to warm up on the way to school. And the school was a little hot. And I told you that they gave us
The bread.
the little piece of bread, and they gave us newspapers to do our homework in between the lines under kerosene lamps. And so this uncle of mine, who was my mother's sister's husband, he connected the train back again very quickly, and he was really injured. There was a bullet that went through, and it went like all over past his arm, but it didn't take his arm off, luckily. And then we wound up in Lodz.
Mm-hmm.
So you probably heard of the city,
Yes.
Lodz,
Yeah.
so you know how to spell it.
LODZ, yep.
Sort of LODZS,
Z.
Lodz, DZS, Lodz.
Or Rouge in Polish.
And when we were in Lodz at that time, if you go on Google, you can Google and find out about the Kielce pogrom. After the war, people were going to find their loved ones in a little city called Kielce. And the Polish people were there, and they attacked the people that lived through the war, and they killed them. They had a pogrom there. And we were in Lodz. They settled us in one of it was like a hospital, or it might have been maybe a school. We were all on the floor, and they put dividers in between the families with little curtains and we all slept on the floor. And at that time, they created an Aliyah base. I'm sure you heard of it, right? An illegal transport to take the Jewish people out from Poland. And so we had no money, absolutely nothing. But we happened to be in that area where these people came, and they formed an illegal transport. And they took the Jewish people onto trucks, and they put us on a train up to Czechoslovakia. And in Czechoslovakia, we had to crossed over the border from Poland into Czechoslovakia on foot in the winter. And we crossed over the border, and in Czechoslovakia, they had the guards, and they sort of searched us to see if we have any weapons or anything. We had absolutely nothing. We just carried a little bag with us, maybe with a change of clothing. And they put us on a train in Czechoslovakia, and they shipped us to Germany, to a displaced persons camp.
Do you know
We
where?
wound up in Germany in Ulm, ULM, on the Danube River. Ulm an Donau, it's called. Ulm an Donau. The Danube River was called in German Donau. And we were, again, it was called, the place that we stayed is where German soldiers stayed. So it was like a barracks. And it was called Sedan, that was the name of the street. Sedan Kaserne. Kaserne were the barracks where the Germans used to stay. So they put us all into these barracks and settled us there. And the United Nations Relief Organization and the American Joint Organization. Do you know the Joint?
Yeah.
The Jewish organization called Joint.
Yes.
They would bring food for us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they gave us canned peas, canned string beans. We never saw food like that in our life, ever. And so a lot of people, we were so very, very hungry, so a lot of people started to attack the food. And their intestines were very narrow and very, very bad. And they would die because they couldn't tolerate the kind of food. So they started teaching us how to eat the food a little bit at a time. But we never ate canned food, so they had to teach us and tell us what this is or that. We were like in a total different, like in a culture shock. So they started giving us flour and a little butter. So my mother and I, we would bake and make our own little bread or little cookies or something. And it was like a pass to go if we needed to go into a clinic or a hospital or something. We would have a pass so we could go in for free because we had no money. We were displaced. So at that period, we were there for almost 5 years in a displaced persons camp. And the first year, on that Sedanstrasse, which is the Sedan Street that we lived on in the barracks, the first year they took the people that lived in the apartments across the street. They were German. They took them out of there totally, completely, and resettled them somewhere else and put us, because we were the first that came there, they put us into those apartments. So, this is something that people can't understand and imagine that this can happen to people. We got an apartment, and with us stayed an elderly lady. There was an extra room, so my sister and I stayed in one room with my parents. And then this room was to a single elderly lady that survived the war. And we had a kitchen with gas burners, and they gave us pots, and they gave us dishes. And the first time in 6 years of the war, we could go in and take a warm shower. We were dancing up and down. I can't begin to tell you how happy we were to shower and to wash our hair and to get a piece of soap and to wash our body. It was like a miracle. And then after that, from here, from the United States, they gathered care packages from children and they would send the care packages to the camps in Germany and in Austria, because Austria and Germany were divided into 4 zones: the American zone, the English zone, the Russian zone, and the French zone. And we wound up on the American zone, and the children would send packages, boxes, and they would have crayons, and they would have little books, little candies, and chewing gum. So we didn't know what the chewing gum was for, and we would ask, and they would tell us, well, you chew it, it's gum, and you spit it out. But we wanted to keep it and save it. So I would take my gum and I would stick it on the wall, so I would save it for the next day and have it again. And then one day came a truckload of shoes, children's shoes, and they brought them into camp. So they took all the children and they took us into a room, and all the shoes were thrown around on the floor, like 2 shoes together, you know, like,
Tied together.
because they sent them from the United States. They collected clothing and shoes, and I saw a pair of black patent leather shoes, and I ran and I picked them up. Of course, they were like 2 or 3 sizes bigger, but I stuffed them with paper, so I would have a pair of shoes to wear.
Was that your first pair of shoes in a long
That was
time?
the first pair of shoes that I had after the war. And then they gave us clothing to wear, and then my father would go out and he would work, and then he would again barter, you know, like I would give you this and you could give me that. And eventually, I don't know how, but he got a bicycle, and I learned how to ride on a bike. And this is how I would go to the go out and buy food. Again, I told you I had those long braids, and then I spoke German. They taught us German because we were in Germany.
And, there was
And
a
they taught
school-
us Hebrew.
Mm.
They sent teachers from Israel to teach us Hebrew so we could go to Israel.
So
from
in the
Germany.
DEP camp you learned this?
Yes, we learned Hebrew and German. So I would use my bicycle, and I had a little basket, and I would go to the market and buy little vegetables and whatever we could afford. They used to give us little food, and I would buy, and we would cook our own food in our own little apartment.
Mm.
And they also had doctors that would come, and they would examine us to make sure that we didn't have any kind of diseases. And then my mother's father had 2 sisters in Poland. And after World War I, there were very few men to marry them off. So my grandfather put them on a boat and shipped them to the United States. So my mother had 2 aunts living in New York City. One lived in Coney Island, in Brooklyn, and one lived in Manhattan. And so my mother kept in touch with them because she had their addresses. When my grandfather was alive and he had the shoe business, my mother kept his books because she was wonderful. She was educated and she was good in math and writing, so she wrote them in Yiddish. She wrote to them because everybody could read Jewish. And the aunts also, so she wrote to them letters that we are in a displaced persons camp, gave them the address, and at that time, the most wonderful president of the United States, President Truman, opened up a quota for displaced persons could come to the United States, providing that they do not have any venereal diseases, tuberculosis, or any kind of any disease, and they would be able to come to America. So my mother's aunt, who lived in New York, had a son who was an attorney, and he went to the American consulate, were registered to go on the exodus to Israel. But we got papers from America from my mother's uncle, an aunt, and their son signed the papers that we will not be, the government will not be responsible for us. We will not become wards of the government. They will take care of us. So we went through camps in order to, we went from our camp to a different campsite where they interrogated us and wanted to know why we wound up in a forced labor camp, where we're from, and everything. They took our fingerprints, and it was like a transitional camp. And from there, we went through all the physicals, and everything was okay. I was a teenager. My sister was 12, and I was 17, going on 18, something like that, my sister. And they put us on one of the boats that was the boats that the United States used. It was horrible. It took us 9 days in September of 1949 that we came, September 25, and the name of the boat is called SS Han, H-A-A-N, I think. You can look him up. My son Martin looked up all the information on the internet. So we came to the United States in 1949, and we were on this boat, and we were so sick, I can't begin to tell you, from seasick. There were ladies that were pregnant, and so I was fine. I did not get seasick on that boat, and I had to collect all the children and take them to the children's dining room and feed all the children, make sure that they would eat and bring them back. So, being down in that area, I would take my blouse and pull it up, and I would put lemons all around and bring them upstairs and cut them, and the women would suck on the lemons, the pregnant women, so they would not vomit. Because in New York, when I was walking in New York, and people used to stop me and say, "Oh, you're Ida, right? You saved my life," in a joking way. But we came to New York. Right before we were coming into the East River Drive, there was this lady standing. And the captain of the boat got on the intercom, and he said, "Do you see that lady standing? She is called our Statue of Liberty." He spoke in different languages, and he explained what the Statue of Liberty stands for. So I get very
It's okay.
choked up. And he explained to us what the Statue of Liberty stands for. So when we got off the boat, everybody, including me, we were kissing the ground on the East River Drive. And there were young ladies standing in uniforms from Red Cross, and they were giving us hot chocolate and donuts. How could you ever forget that? And then my mother's relatives came to the boat, they picked us up, and the aunt and uncle lived on the Lower East Side in Manhattan. So we stayed with them until my dad got a job in the district where tailors, where people were tailors. My father was a wonderful tailor. And my sister went to school right away, and my mother's uncle took me to work in a factory. And my parents and I went to school at night to Washington Irving High School in Manhattan to learn English for foreign born. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
So in school, they taught English for foreign born, but the young people, like my age, they taught us typing, stenography, and bookkeeping. So after 1 year, I got a job working already in the first year I worked in a factory where my uncle worked. And in the factory, they used to make belts, cowboy belts. And I stood at a machine, a printing machine, where you print the leather with the different cowboy figurines, you know, like horses and people, hats and all. So I was standing for 1 year, and I was working in the factory until I learned English, and I learned how to write English and read, and then I got a job working in a office. It was called United States Stationery and Pencil Company. I'll never forget that. So I would type, and we used to they used to print the initials from companies on the pencils and on the papers. So we would get orders, and I would fill out the orders and give it to the people in the factory, which was next door, and they would fill the orders and pack it, and we would ship it to the people that did the ordering. And then I met my husband in New York City, on the Lower East Side.
Do you remember the year?
Yes, he came in 1951. He was also in a forced labor camp somewhere in Siberia, but I don't know the area. And we met. By then, I got a better job, and I was working in the jewelry district on 45th Street in Manhattan. And he was in a displaced persons camp in Salzburg, in Austria. So he had an older brother and a cousin, and the older brother and my husband wanted to go to engineering school, and the cousin wanted to go to college to become a chemist. So they went to Graz, and that was a city, an engineering city in Austria, and they started engineering school there. I think my husband must have been about 16 or 17 years old. That was during the time that they stayed after the war in a DP camp, probably 5 years or 6 years also. And so they started engineering school, and when they came to New York, his oldest brother went to school also, and my husband went at night to City College of New York, and he worked during the day for an engineering company as a draftsman. And then we got married, and I was working, and he was working, and we decided that we're not going to have children until he gets his engineering degree, so he would get a proper job. And so it took almost 4 years for him at night to graduate City College of New York in engineering, and then his brother graduated also, and his cousin became a chemist. He graduated also in New York, one of the colleges, I don't remember which. And then that year, after he graduated, we got married in 1953, June 20th. And we waited like 2.5 years, and our first son was born in August of 1956. And his name is Robert. And then my second son was born 18 months later, and his name is Martin. And then after that, I had a very bad miscarriage in my 5th month. And after that, I had a daughter, Linda.
When was she born?
Robert was born in 56, Marty was born in 58, she was born in 61, and Debbie was born in 63. So I have 2 sons and 2 daughters. So my husband's engineering company was transferring engineers so they would be closer to the customers. And he worked for Western Electric, which is part of AT&T, Bell, you know, okay. So we chose Baltimore so we could be close to New York to visit our family because part of our family lived in New York. So we moved to Baltimore and the children started school here. And when my youngest daughter, Debbie, started first grade, I called the Board of Education and I said, I would like to become a registered nurse because I lived through the war and I saw all the horrific things that happened. I saw dead people, people with shrapnels, people that were buried alive. And so I wanted to help, do something for people, for humanity. So I called the Board of Education. She says, okay, you come down and bring your high school diploma and we'll tell you, set you up on what you have to do. I said, I'm very sorry, I don't have a high school diploma. Oh, okay, so you have to go and get the GED and you have to do the tests for that.
Wait, I thought you went to Washington Irving High School while you worked in the factory. Did you not get your diploma then?
No, that's where I was learning English.
Oh, you just learned English
Just
there?
English.
Just English, didn't even get
English
to school.
for foreign born, right,
Okay.
That's all they taught us. So, and it was at night, after school, after work.
Yeah, you're
I
tired.
used to go after work and it was like a 2-hour session in school and that was it. Like 4 days a week we used to go. So I went and I took the test 2 weekends in a row, never studying. I didn't know that you have to study for it. And I come home and I have 4 children and my husband, I said, now you know how your mommy is not very smart. I took the test and I don't think I passed it because they had questions that I was never tested like that in my life. Like you are tested in high school and in school. And I said, one of the words was algae, and I thought it's algebra, shortened. But I didn't know what algae was. But then the way the questions were, I said, well, I don't think it's algebra. So I took a chance and I passed. I got my diploma, and then
You don't even need to
with
study.
4 children and a husband, I started, first I took 3 credits, then I went and got 6 credits, then I took 9 credits, and I took summer courses, and I went to college, and I became a registered nurse, and I graduated the same day when my son Martin graduated high school. And I worked at St. Agnes Hospital as an OBGYN labor delivery baby nurse for over 10 years or so, more, maybe 15. And then I switched and I worked at Sinai Hospital because my daughter Linda, she got a scholarship to play volleyball at the University of Maryland. And within a year she got injured and needed arthroscopic surgery in her knee. And I had no family here, and I needed to take her to Kernan Hospital for her exercises, physical therapy. So I couldn't go back to St. Agnes, so I applied to Sinai, and I worked there for a long time. And here I am. 3 of my children are married. I have 1 beautiful granddaughter, Alyssa. She graduated, that's her high school graduation. And the 2 boys are my older daughter's 2 sons. And Alyssa has a brother, Max, who is going to be 17 in May, going on 30. He's very bright. And my daughter Linda has these 2 young men, Adam and Evan. Adam graduated Temple University, and he is now 23, and he works for the Mets in New York.
Oh, cool.
That's
And
nice.
Evan is in his 2nd year of college. I think I told you, Dickinson University. And then my oldest son has a boy who is 16 and a half. He got married late, Alex. So I have 4 young boys and one young lady. She's my princess. So I have Alyssa, Adam, Evan, Max, and Alex. And they are very wonderful children. All my children, they always call me. They always come here and help me. And then my first husband died at the age of 54 of cancer here in Baltimore. And then about 3 years later, I was introduced to another gentleman who was a widower. My first husband and I were married 30 years. And he died that year that we were married 30 years.
I'm sorry.
And his name was, did I give you his
You
name?
actually didn't give us his
No.
name.
His name,
Ooh, that just took a tumble.
his name was, the Hebrew name was Abraham. His American name was Alfred. Excuse me. Excuse,
Ooh, there's some tea right there.
yeah, excuse me. Thank you. He died of a very unusual kind of cancer. He had it for 7 years, and I worked and I took care of him. I took him to the hospital, down to University Hospital for his radiation. You know, he had radiation at Sinai, but chemo at University Hospital. He had cancer for 7 years. He had 4 surgeries. And I kept on working. I worked like 10, 12-hour shifts because Debbie, my youngest daughter, she was 19 when my husband died, and she was at University of Maryland. She just finished first year. And then about 2 years later, I was introduced to a gentleman who was a widower. His name was Irvin, I-R-V-I-N. That's why I have 2 names, Schmidt-Chait. So my first husband was Alfred Schmidt. In Jewish, they called him Abe, but it was Abraham. In English, it was Alfred. And then I met Irvin Chait, and we were introduced. It was just very, very, it's a long story how we were introduced. I don't know whether you want it written or told.
We actually are running out of a little bit of time, but
You don't have much time?
unfortunately, no.
No, that's okay. So my children accepted him very much. He was a very nice, wonderful person. And my grandchildren did not know any other grandpa except Grandpa Irv. And he was very doting, very kind, and he had a lot of patience. And he was misdiagnosed 1 year. And then finally, when he was diagnosed, it was a little too late, and he had cancer that traveled through his right arm, and they had to amputate his arm 2 inches below his elbow at the age of 88, or 88, 89, yeah, about 86 or 87. So he was an amputee, and he had a cancer that was misdiagnosed. It was called an adenocarcinoma that was in the sweat glands and tissues. And my husband had a very unusual cancer. It was called a liposarcoma in his right thigh. But I have to be strong. My children say, Ma, you have to be strong. So how much stronger can I be? Even iron bends, right?
Yep.
Yes, so I try my best. I try to be very positive. I'm very fortunate that I came to this country and I lived through the Holocaust, and I have been speaking about it and telling whoever wants to hear me. And everybody should know, because it goes from generation to generation, because I am the last generation. After me, it's my grandchildren, my children and grandchildren that will know. But whether they would be talking about Jewish Council, and they sent an extra tape to Yale University's archives, and I made a tape for Spielberg. And now I'm making one for you.
For Goucher College.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much.
So you have been wonderful. You have been very patient.
Of course, of course.
And so what do you do? Now this is going to become a,
Yeah, well, we're good.
eventually.
Interview's over.
Did you want me to say any more?
Do you have any
Well,
questions?
first I wanted to thank you and your professor that called me from Goucher College.
Mhm.
And I'm very, very much into education, because if any of my grandchildren say, oh, college is so hard, I say, excuse me, just think of your grandma. I had 4 children, a husband, and I went to college not knowing the English language, and I had to take all kind of subjects that pertain to medicine. To become a nurse, I had to take biology, microbiology, chemistry. I had to open up an animal and learn all about the animals, you know, all the blood, where the blood goes and where it comes from, and the heart and the lungs and everything. And you are complaining to me, I was in my 30s when I went to college. You have the most wonderful opportunity going to school and getting a great education. And so they don't complain anymore. College is good, everything is great, and they are all wonderful. And I'm very grateful, really, that I have people that come and listen to me, because I feel that if it's not told, it's going to come again. Because you know that history repeats itself. Look what's going on in the world right now.
Oh my gosh.
When this last incident happened in California, I was home alone and I was watching the news. I was so shook up and I was so choked up. When my children called, I couldn't talk. I just couldn't talk. For anybody to go and to kill people for nothing. For nothing. And to do what they are doing now throughout the world, it is horrible. Horrible. So, it's just, you know, when I watch the news and I listen to the news, and sometimes when they talk at certain areas and certain subjects, it brings back so many memories to my own life and my own childhood, what we all went through during the war. It is horrendous. Nobody should know anything like that, because so many people went through so many things. I mean, to go and to gas people and put them into crematoriums and burn their bodies, and to bury people alive and to kill them for nothing. 6 million of us. But somebody sent me something on the computer that no matter who is ever going to do anything bad to us, is going to go down in history, if you think about it. With the Spanish Inquisition, with everybody that came and tried to eliminate us, they went down. Every country, every nation that started to abuse Jewish people did not succeed. And now we have people from all these people that remained. We have a land of our own, we have people of our own, and there's so much education going on there, so much, and they share it with all the world in the hospital. And so hopefully, perhaps, if people start loving each other and respecting each other for what we are, maybe this world is going to change one day. And we have to have hope and love in our hearts and continue hoping and being strong. So, I thank you very much. You are wonderful.
Thank you.
I'm sorry that I just choked up, especially when the captain was telling us about the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah.
Of course, my children were there, and my children went to many times, and my grandchildren, to the Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Have you been back to Europe or been back to Warsaw?
Yes, I have been with my second husband. I was in Warsaw, and I was in Auschwitz,
Mm-hmm.
and I went to other camps, concentration camps. Yeah, I needed clothing. Yeah. And everywhere we went, it was through a Jewish organization. Like Margaret Moores is from Florida. Years ago we went, so they would take us to all the Jewish areas and synagogues and all. Yes. I've been to Poland, I've been to Czechoslovakia,
Me too.
I've been to Austria. Yeah. And I went to Germany too. We saw the wall that was down already.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And we were in Israel. I was in Israel because I had my grandmother. See, part of our family we came to America. But the rest of the family on my mother's side, they went to Israel. And my father was the youngest of 13 siblings, and only 3 survived.
Yeah.
My father and his 2 brothers. One went to Argentina and one went to Israel.
Well, thank you so much for the interview.
Sure.
I think we're gonna end now, but thank you.
Are you making copies of this or?